leading the session along with Jan. And before we start, I know it's 6 p.m. So I'm going to ask you to do whatever you need to do to get comfortable. If that means that you turn your screen off, if that means that you grab a drink of water, that you just relax as we seek to really engage in a conversation tonight. I want for us to reframe it. So it's not a training or a session, it's more of a conversation. So what are we here? What will we talk about? So today we're here to explore our identities and our lived experiences and how these shape the way we engage in high-stake conversations. Jan, if you could move the slide. Because sometimes the most critical moments in our work involves really influencing change. And this happens in high stakes conversations, right? When something is at stake, when something is important. And high stake conversations happen in all areas of our life. So not just work, it happens in our personal life, in our professional life, in our social lives as well. And in these conversations, sometimes what you find is that emotions may be high, and we need to work really hard to manage ourselves while engaging with the other individuals that we're having a conversation with. These are conversations that you find people really don't like to have because it's one of those uncomfortable spaces and places sometimes that we find ourselves. And it's a natural part of relationships. And maybe if we choose a different perspective, what we'll realize is that these can be very productive conversations. We'll be able to unlock just better ways of relating to each other, talking about important issues, if we take the time to plan and really approach them in a way that will be rewarding for all. So our intention for the session this evening, we've really designed a highly interactive and actionable workshop to support you in navigating these types of conversation. And I think what's most important is that we want you to really lean into the fact that this is a place and space for you to be able to unpack your social identities and your perceptions and the ways that you perceive high-stake conversations. And I think at the end of the session, you recognize that you are more prepared based on just sharing in a way that is honest and open, and we'll be providing you with a tool as well, so that you do have something to fall back on in the event you need to have the conversation. So what's on our agenda for tonight? We'll be looking at identity and high-stake conversations. We're going to talk a little bit about what happens when conversations go off the rail, right? They don't always go as planned. We're going to talk about what are some threat responses. Then we're going to look at how do you have a conversation intentionally? So that's a conversation by design. And we're going to give you the opportunity to really plan for that conversation, wanting to have, needing to have in that conversation that is important to you. So just wanted to share some basic conversation principles that we want to just embrace tonight that will help us to really engage in a way that we feel heard and seen. And Jan is going to be sharing our conversation principles. She's going to be just moving the slide. So I'm not going to read these. I'm just going to ask you to take a moment just to acknowledge what we're asking, just to set us up for success. So be present as much as you possibly can. This is your time. This is a learning opportunity for you. So maybe close all the screen. If you can, turn your cell phones off. And most importantly, I'd love to encourage you to slow down, think, and reflect. As with all of our trainings, we want the space to be an inclusive space for all. And we do have some inclusive participation principles, and we aim to co-create that here today. And so we're going to offer the following principles, which we gratefully borrowed from our private work, because we thought this would be good to share. So assume good intent, right? We're all here with different forms of experiences, education, communication. And there are things that are happening with us, maybe in our personal lives. Some of us may be navigating family. I know I had to get home and ensure my son has his dinner, etc., right? There may be family that you have to really give an eye on, or health concerns. Be open to accountability. And that is because if you're not open to accountability, what happens is that you won't act in a way that is intentional. And when we talk about intentionality, what we're hoping will not happen is that we won't have an experience of anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, racist, transphobic, any of those things that will make the session feel as though it's discriminatory in any way. Be mindful of the space that you take, right? So I'd love to encourage you to take up lots of space, but just be mindful that this is a shared space. We want to honor pauses in conversations, which may allow others the comfort to speak. We want to ask that you respect pronouns. So honor the pronouns that are shared. We want to ask that you give people the space to engage, accessibly. So honor the ways in which individuals are choosing to share their comments or engage. And there are lots of ways for you to engage with us tonight. You can use the chat box, you can unmute yourself, you can raise your hand if you'd like to speak. And last but not least, when it comes to a personal experience, that is given and not asked for. So we're not going to be asking for personal experience. Our focus tonight is really supporting change in the workplace. Alrighty, there is an action planner that will help you. And my slides will have the page number if I forget to mention numbers there. And Janet is going to be sharing that in the chat in a moment.
Actually, that was sent out by email from Emma to everyone. So you can refer to the email that was sent with the pre-work agenda. That also included the fillable PDF for tonight's session. If anybody is having difficulty accessing that in your email, just email, you can text me privately in the chat and I'll make sure you get it. All right. Emma as well can do the same.
Nicole, sorry to interrupt. You're cutting out just a little bit at times.
Am I?
Do you want to maybe try with your camera off and see if that, it's not bad, but maybe try your camera off and we'll see if that helps.
Okay. Is this better for you?
Let's continue. I can let you know if it gets.
Okay, thank you.
Body.
Alrighty. So last week we sent you an email and asked you to reflect on some questions. We asked you to think about what skill you'd like to develop to help you with your ability to have these difficult or high-stake conversations, right? And as you were reflecting, it may have been around being less reactive, listening a little bit better than your view with clarity, pausing before having an important discussion, and not delaying so much before engaging in those high-stake conversations. So I'm going to ask you now to pause and in a moment, just reflect on what particular skill are you working on? And since this is your learning experience, what is your intention for time together? And these questions are in your action planner on page 1. And in a moment, I'm going to be asking you to share in the chat, what is your intention for tonight? Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that. Just waiting to hear from just a few more individuals. What is your why? What is your intention for tonight? I'm seeing some comments about really embracing tension and disagreement. Seeing some comments around difficult conversations. So reflecting on maybe a past situation. We're working on the scale of confidence for opinion. And really to build your arsenal of strategies to utilize in these types of discussions. So take a moment as well, just to pause and see what your peers are saying and see what's resonating with you. Thank you, Renee. Thanks everyone for sharing. And if you haven't shared your intention in the chat, just make note to self. So what is high-stake conversations and why are they so important? And I do believe that all of us are leaders, whether it be a people leader, self-leader, you're leading a process, you're leading change. And the work of a leader is really to be able to influence others. A lot of the time, influence requires us to be very intentional about the way we engage in conversations. And very often, these conversations will feel like high-stake conversation. So in a high-stake conversations, opinion will differ, and the stakes are high for the people and issues that you care about the most. So what are you close to your heart? And sometimes you don't have mutual trust with the individuals that you are having the conversation with. Emotions can definitely run high in these situations, and we can get triggered and soak in other people. Conversations can feel especially high stake when they relate to things like our identity. So for example, if you're addressing microaggression, systemic oppressions, gaslighting, racism, transphobia, homophobia, these are all examples of the very complex and charged conversations change. And we can add that to the list of high-stake conversations that every employee navigates, such as asking for a raise, right? Or having an important performance conversation, or maybe offering some feedback, and it may be difficult feedback. And when you think about handling these conversations, in order for the conversation to go well, it really does require focus and intention. And we want to really attune to the other person that you're having the conversation with and work really hard to self-manage. This really takes self-care, it takes planning, it takes preparation, and also being able to communicate with a balance of inquiry and advocacy. And the work of navigating change, it means that sometimes we have to have conversations that matter, engaging with people in ways that are brave, courageous, curious. And sometimes you have to be brave enough to touch upon topics in which you might feel very vulnerable. So when we successfully engage in high-stake conversations, people walk away as a result, they feel a deeper understanding of the intentions and the perspectives of one another. When we do this, this builds the foundation for trust, right? And it's at this stage that the possibility happens. And that's the possibility of creating new insight and shared action for progress. So I want to pause here and I'd like to hear from you. What are some examples of high-stake conversations that you have in your own role or in what you're trying to accomplish in the world? So maybe in your change efforts, take a moment now and just share in the chat. What are you experiencing? Conversations. What are examples that find that you will have to engage in these types of conversations? And so think about the work that you do or the change efforts that you're engaged in. When might it be necessary to engage in a that's culture stake? So mediation, yes. Leading through change. Negotiation, right? Cultural change as well. And how to, when you're having constructive conversations. And you have to make decisions as well. So seeing some very common themes here in the chat. Speaking when it might be uncomfortable. Jan, am I still cutting out? Can you hear me?
A little bit, but I'm following along, so everyone knows that if I will jump in if there's a major phrase or word that I feel you may be missing. I think the words that are cutting out are minimal. If people are having difficulty, we're working in the background with Nicole, just trying to get her to orient herself closer to her router to see if that will improve the quality, but we'll also keep troubleshooting on one of the breaks as well.
Alrighty.
If others are having any other difficulty, just please let me know in the chat. But I'm listening to see if there are major phrases. It's just the odd word that's cutting in and out, but the gist of what you're saying, Nicole, the overall 95% of the sentences where there is a cutout, we're hearing you.
Okay, thank you, Jan. Alrighty, so I saw some examples relating to having conversations around performance, sometimes when you're navigating change, when you're leading change. And what Jan and I have found is that every day in our coaching practice, we hear countless stories from leaders of conversations that they avoid sometimes. And we know that it is human nature to avoid difficult conversations, particularly because they're difficult and partly because we're worried that having them could make things worse. So sometimes we worry about these conversations putting a strain on our relationships, etc. We all know that sometimes the fear is around not being able to have that conversation. The conversations may go off the rails, so they may not go as planned. And oftentimes, we see how quickly these high-stake conversations can deteriorate into unproductive, reactive, and defensive conversations. So I want to hear from you again, and you can share in the chat or unmute if you so choose. What makes these high-stake conversations go off the rail? What are some factors you think that really influence off the rails? Have you ever had it right? I'm seeing emotions. So think about those conversations that you've either experienced or witnessed that didn't go as planned. Just take a moment just to see if there's resonance with you from what your colleagues are also sharing. What are the commonalities? How do you think, do you tell us a little bit more about that?
Can you repeat that, Nicole? Who are you asking to elaborate?
Kyle had shared something in the chat, not recognizing what each other want from the conversation.
Kyle.
this one resonates for me for maybe even a negotiation. You go into it not, sometimes people hold things too close to their chest and don't state up front what they're trying to gain from the negotiation. And therefore maybe negotiating against themselves because the other party doesn't know what you're actually looking for. So if I had learned once before that if you can somewhat state plainly up front what each party's looking for, it actually can get to a win-win as opposed to arguing when it may not be necessary.
Thank you for sharing, Kyle. Grant, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your thoughts around that?
Yeah, happy to. I just find in highly politicized settings, whether it's a board or elsewhere, especially in this kind of current political environment, everyone seeks to be right and feel that the other side is wrong and that there's no middle ground. And when you're trying to do intentional work with different audiences, different communities, it's really hard to find that balance and kind of facilitate and mediate a conversation where people are willing to meet in the middle, so to speak.
All righty. That's a very good point. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm seeing some other good comments in the chat. Take a moment if you can and just see what your colleagues are saying and look for resonance there. So when we think about it, this type of communication breakdown, too common in high-stake conversations. And in our work at Strategy Sense, we spend a lot of time unpacking this and working on strategies to handle these conversations and to handle them well. And here are some themes of what we often hear and is reflected in all of the literature when you think about reading about high-stake conversations. And these conversations break down are due to these common mistakes that we often make as humans. So it could be internal, and that is when we get triggered or there's a threat response, or we may be acting out of fear. Sometimes sometimes we take things personally, and sometimes we lose sight of the big picture. Then there's relational. So when there's lack of respect, so not respecting each other, sometimes we make assumptions about the other person's intention, and sometimes we're not aligned around a shared goal. So we don't take the opportunity to find out if there's alignment around a particular goal or outcome that we're trying to achieve. Then it's behavioral, right? So if you think about the trend and how these things happen, beginning with the internal, it does impact your behavior. Sometimes we're in combat mode. Sometimes we lash out or we may shut down, and that's like the fight or flight response. We become reactive sometimes. Sometimes we're not clear, and sometimes the timing isn't right. So many of these mistakes stems from the first thing, which is our threat response. And as we navigate high-stake conversation, it can be so easy to get hooked onto something that we perceive as a threat. And this is human because our brains are really hardwired to perceive change or anything that's different as a threat. And this is why we can so easily stop in that pattern. And when this happens, or our brain perceives that there's a threat, there's a chemical cocktail that courses through our veins. And this reaction was really designed to help us survive the presence of a real threat to our physical survival. Now, the issue with that is that our brains can't often tell the difference between a threat or physical survival and a threat to our ego or a threat to our identity. So in those moments, we react, we get defensive if there's a threat, and this is natural and normal. Not just as human beings, if we feel threatened, then there's going to be a response. So when we're triggered, however, we're not in a state of high creativity. We're not in a state of collaboration, innovation, and relational connection. Instead, we become closed-minded, we become defensive, and we enter into that fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so when this happens, where the other person may shut down, or they may become very passive and accommodating or withdrawing from the conversation altogether and not achieving results. So I would like for you to reflect for just a moment. Think about a recent conversation, a high-stake conversation that you've had that did not go well, right? Or maybe a conversation that you needed to have and that you avoided. And as you reflect on the conversation that did not go as well as you hoped, what was happening for you in those moments? What were you feeling? Did you perceive a threat to your need for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, or fair? Did you behave? Take a minute for you just to reflect, and you had received this in your pre-work. For you to think about experience. And this is also on page 3 of your action planner as well. And I forgot to mention that it's clickable and fillable, so you can simply just click and type. I want you to hold down your responses, unpack them, and I'm going to be sharing with you just a model that explains what happens. And this was developed by Dr. David Rock, and he's the director of the Newer Leadership Institute, and he created the SCARF model. And this model really helps us to understand the 5 primary social dimensions which often our brains respond to when there is perceived threat and rewards. So when there's some responses that would probably happen, or some things that will help to determine the response or the reward, and that is status. And when we think about status, we're talking about how relatively important this is to others, right? When we think about certainty, it's being able to predict the future. So what's happening next? When we think about autonomy, this provides a sense of control over the events. And relatedness means that there's a sense of safety with others. So we think of it in the terms of friend rather than it's a perception of change between individuals. And we've included some information about this in your action planner, but just to show you what happens and how do we respond to threat, and what are some of the factors that will determine our responses to these threats that we are experiencing.
So knowing that when we are in these situations where stakes are high, we're trying to influence or come to a common understanding, that individuals often have one of 2 ways of responding. And what we may be experiencing is people's lack of alignment, or what their needs not being met in one of these 5 dimensions. We wouldn't suggest that everything is reduced to these 5 dimensions when it comes to interpersonal interactions, but it can be a start to understanding and unpacking what may be going on, right? So is the individual potentially feeling their status, how they relate to their role or their status within a situation, is that being compromised, or is that not being honored? Is their inability to understand what may be next for them, are they feeling destabilized in terms of certainty? Or perhaps their sense of control over what they're responsible for, what may be happening around them, again, being destabilized, or feeling like it's not safe to trust, or not feeling safe or trusted in a relationship. That's the relatedness piece. Or that they are not being fairly or equitably treated in the situation. And that's the fairness. So often when you're experiencing engagement and positivity and alignment, and people willing to work towards, perhaps several of these factors are being honored. When we're often experiencing a threat response, one or more of these may not be being honored, and maybe a place for you to look and be curious. I'm jumping in, Nicole, because you were cutting in and out a little bit in your explanation. So I just want to make sure it lands for everyone.
Alrighty.
We've included information on this in your action planner as a takeaway resource for you to review after our time together. There's also lots of literature that became even more popular during the height of the pandemic. Lots of literature online regarding the SCARF model if you want to do your further exploration or research on this for yourself. I'll turn it back to you, Nicole.
Thanks, Jan. So we want to spend some time now just exploring the role of our identities and social location in high-stake conversations, particularly when they didn't go as planned or when they go off the rails. So the first step is figuring out how to have these high-stake conversations. And the very first step is really understanding how you show up in these conversations. How does your identity influence your perceptions and the way that you be perceived? It is always to start with self-reflection. So really take the time to reflect with yourself about yourself. How do you understand your own identity and relationship to the topic? Think about your position in the organization, your power to make change, and the likelihood that the person you're engaging in the conversation with will be receptive to enable you to approach the conversation in a way that is strategic. So these are some things that we want to start thinking about, right? And when we do this introspective work, it really helps us to show up in a way that will really help us to get our desired outcome, right? So we strategize and the conversations will be more effective. When a conversation sometimes feels hard or difficult, or when they're not effective, it's often because one or more of the parties are not ready to have the conversation, or they probably just don't want to have that tough conversations. And sometimes the question of readiness is more about who is having the conversation, right? So the level of trust and the power dynamics with the other person. So these are some things that we and you can relate to the statement. It's not what you say or how you say it, but sometimes it's who is saying it that matters, right? Because we can say different things to different people and it does have a different impact based on who is saying it in the moment. And it can be easier to speak openly and engage in difficult conversations with our peers rather than our bosses, or when our colleagues share the same racial identity than with those who don't share that with us, or with colleagues who have similar personalities, right? So if you're more extroverted, probably it's easier to have a conversation with that individual who matches your personality.
And as Nicole was saying, if you're more quieter or if you're more extroverted, right, that you may find an affinity to one or the other, right? Sometimes it's the opposite that you're attracted to in being able to do so. Or somebody who's more similar to you in your personalities. Go ahead, Nicole, you cut out a bit there.
Right, so we want to think about in what places do we find ourselves where we're able to have a conversation and we feel as though when we show up in that conversation, or because there is a match level, you may be more competent, you may be more comfortable, you may be accepting or authoritative. We want to think about identity and understand that identity really plays a critical role in different conversations. So if we are to be successful, we really need to develop the intentional strategies to avoid our own biases, right? Because we all have our biases. We want to manage the biases of others, and we may encounter And where possible, we want to think about leveraging our position. So let's talk about social identity for a moment. So on screen, what you see are, John,
Sorry,
if you
Nicole. Sorry, Nicole.
right?
Sorry.
That's okay, are different categories. And these categories really help us to determine our sense of self based on our own perception or the perception of others. And we talk about things such as race, gender identity, class, country of origin, religion, and some other social identities, right? And there's that intersectional space that we find ourselves in. And some can change and some can result in advantage and others disadvantages. So for me, I would say that I'm a Black Jamaican woman, I'm a single mother, I am living in Canada now. In terms of religion, I identify as Christian, I'm 40 something. And these are the places that I find myself or the groups that I identify with. Jan, what about you?
Well, so for myself, I identify as a straight cis woman. I'm in my 50s, Canadian born. I'm the daughter of Jamaican immigrants who came to Canada in the late 1950s. So how I was raised, the things I was exposed to, was raised in a middle-class family. I'm raising an 18-year-old cis male as well. And I sometimes experience, I think of how my identity and the things I interact with as I navigate the world running a business or facilitating and working with clients, facilitating sessions, working with clients. I sometimes find I experience racism or I experience sexism. Sometimes it's both. There are the intersections as well, multiple intersections. And I found that there are advantages as well. My identity has given me access to resources that others don't have. Being middle class, so less financially unstable than others, has allowed me to be in professional spaces with other female Black leaders where others were not able to be in those spaces. And perhaps my education and class signify to some individuals that that I'm seen as more acceptable, right? I am perhaps less threatening. And I think that having difficult conversations, as challenging as the awareness that I have of the biases that aren't always present for me because of how I speak and some of the experiences that I've had in my professional life, that works to an advantage. And in other spaces, it's a disadvantage. And I'm not always clear when that's going to be present, advantage or disadvantage. But what I am focused on is as Nicole described, this grounding work of being reflective of and my self-awareness of what are my identities, how might I be perceived, how am I even my own biases perceiving situations and individuals and interactions based on identities. And so that these identities that I experience, both self and of others, the awareness that it can influence the content of my discussions. So high-stakes conversations are about dialogue. And so I might miss things or I might pick up on certain things. And so being acutely aware of the potential for that filtering, both on my end and with the participants. Not to overcomplicate things, it's just to stay aware and to stay really curious and ask questions to get clarity and to be mindful of any of the assumptions that I might make. So I'll pause there, Nicole. You asked, so I shared.
Thanks, Jan. And I think something else that is really important for us to remember is that our social identities can also affect how we are heard, right? So our words and action may be interpreted a certain way simply because of our social identity and the biases related to it. So being discriminated because of gender, race, age, etc., right? And so tonight we want to think about how do we avoid these pitfalls and how do we uncover ways that we can leverage identity to build. And doing that, as I mentioned, having self-reflection is the key. And so in your pre-work, you were asked to really take a moment just to think about what identities feel most present for you within the context of high-stake conversations that you're workshopping today. So think about that particular conversation and think about what identities feel most present for you. Also think about in what ways these identities will give you an advantage within the conversation, and in what ways might these identities give you a disadvantage within the conversation, right? Because they're, depending on how you're seen, how you're perceived, where you are, if there's any commonality or not, then it could be an advantage or a disadvantage. So as you consider the scenario that you're workshopping, I want you to think about how does your social identity gives you an advantage or disadvantage. Let's talk a little bit about social location, because that's important as well. So social identity is really the specific group that you belong to. And social location is where our identities puts us in society or in the social system, such as our workplace, right? When you think about social location, this is what happens when your identity interact with each other within our environment. So it also determines the social forces that affects us and the way in which they do. It influences the type of power and privilege we have to the situation in which we have more or less power and privilege. And I think this is important because it helps us to understand why people experience organizations differently. So at work, social identities can really affect the way we're positioned relative to our colleagues, or social location impacts the ways in which we interpret the workplace environment and relationship, while also affecting the impact of our environment and relationship to others, with others as well. So it's important that we reflect and really understand where we fit in the workplace and the social system, and unpacking the ways in which your location affects your. This is vital if you're looking at really navigating and really approaching high-stake conversation in a way that is rewarding. So what we'd like to hear now from you is how might your social identity contribute to conversations going off the rail? So you can either share in the chat or you can unmute to share.
Maybe just to the bottom line, you cut out a little bit there, Nicole, just to say that social location, along with social identities, but social location can really support you with understanding the ways in which how you see yourself fitting into the workplace social system, and unpacking the ways in which location, your identity, or how you relate to your location affects your perception is vital to how we navigate high stakes conversations effectively. So that self-awareness and other awareness of social location can support you with being able to see how we often see situations differently in the workplace.
Thanks, Jan. Alrighty, so we're going to give you an opportunity then to share this in a breakout room. So in a moment, we'll be putting you into breakout rooms. I see some responses coming through in the chat. Jan, do you want to take that question from Jamila? Are you seeing it?
Yes, and so thanks, Jamila. So social location is sort of a combination of all of our various social identities. That could be one way of thinking about social location. Social location also is how we see ourselves in society. So it might be about, often it's considered a class in terms of relating to stature or and class within your environment. And it also is how we relate to privilege in the workplace, in particular in the workplace or in various environments that we're in. Right. So I think that, as you've described, Jamila, that multiple social identities can certainly be showing up for social location. It's how you relate yourself to others, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is the positional or perhaps authoritative relationships that then you or others put you in terms of your the hierarchy or the power or privilege you have in relation to others. So yes, I would say a combination of all of those, of all your identities, but then also it's that space or the relationship then to power or privilege that you have in the environments or the situations that you find yourself in.
Right. And this usually happens during interaction, right? So as John mentioned, sometimes there is the power dynamic that you want to think about as well. Sometimes there's knowledge. So sometimes based on the social identity or based on the group, or as Jan was talking about when she was sharing hers, based on education, based on class, the location that you find yourself in when you're relating to another person.
So we work to move to breakout rooms.
Yeah, so in a moment, we'll be putting you into breakout rooms. There'll be around 3 or 4 other individuals in the breakout room. And when you get there, we'd like for you to share. And you're sharing the questions that are on page 6 in your guide, and you're talking about in what ways might your social identity and social location give you an advantage or a disadvantage within the conversations that you are thinking about having. So the conversation you're workshopping today. We also want to talk about how might social identity and location contribute to conversations going on, so not going as planned. And what is important about how you use your awareness of yours and other individuals' social identity and social location as you navigate these high-stake conversations. So these questions are on page 6 in your guide. You'll be in the breakout rooms for 20 minutes. We'll give you a signal halfway through, and that's just an opportunity for you to know what the amount of time that you have. We ask that you share the time equally in the breakout room. There'll be 3 or 4 individuals. And when you come back, think about who from your group you're going to be asking to share some insights as to what you discussed. So in a moment, Jan is going to be moving you, but I'd like to find out any questions before we move out into the breakout rooms. Okay, perfect. And if you forget what we're discussing, you can use page 6 in your action planner as your guide. Jan, you may open the rooms.
So everyone, Zakriti's just joined us from Mexico on her phone. So you may not be able to see, people are back in the room now. So we're going to transition into a share back from the breakout room discussions. I'll turn it back to you, Nicole.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some robust discussions, and we want to just find out from you about the conversation. So not the details, but the insights. Are you able to share any important insights that came from the conversation that you were having in your breakout rooms? So for this one, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and we can just have one representative from each breakout just share any insights that you may have had.
So what stood out for you? Maybe what's a key takeaway, is it a theme, and without revealing specific examples, but a key takeaway or a theme that emerged for you or in your group, in your discussion? Who'd like to start us off?
I'm happy to. So I was with Nona and Claire. One of the things that I took from our conversation, Nona had mentioned kind of one of the challenges that she was facing, and Claire reflected back sort of this sense that, like, not to let these detractors even preemptively stop you from having those difficult conversations. And I thought that was a really smart comment, because I think a lot of the times, like even in getting to the difficult conversation, we get tripped up on like whether you're the right person to have it or whether you should even be doing this work and like all of those other questions. And for me, those come up a lot, like in the process of like even trying to get to that tough conversation. So I really appreciated that reflection from the group.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing.
Jamila, was that your hand up? Go ahead.
I didn't, but I can add a little bit. We chatted about a number of things. I was with Thompson and Caitlin and Andrea F. And one thing that came up at the end, Andrea mentioned, and I thought it's really interesting, but it was, you know, the reality that high stakes conversations are often these moments in time. Andrea, you can jump into if I'm like mischaracterizing, but like conversations as moments in time, but social identity and the privilege or lack thereof that comes with it is it's not a moment in time, it's systemic in nature. And I think that the conflict of that, making it difficult to figure out strategies for success, right? Like there's the strategies in the moment, but then there's the like grappling with the bigger issue of like social identity plays a role in ultimately who sets out these conversations, like who decides that the conversation can even happen, right, and in which forum. And perhaps there are people who just have the like power or social identity to opt out of these conversations because they don't care or they don't want to answer to them.
Right.
It's like often if you're in a particular social location, you don't get to like force the conversation. So it's like how I think there's like the strategies, the big picture strategies versus the in conversation micro strategies as well. I don't know, Andrea, if I captured, maybe this was, I added a little bit to your point, but hopefully I captured.
Thanks, Jamila. Thanks for sharing. Any other takeaways or insights? So we had 5 groups. Anyone else wants to share? So you can unmute to share, or if you're more comfortable, feel free to share in the chat as well. Any takeaways from your conversation?
We recognize that these can be these conversations can be quite personal conversations, and also, you know, it's like an unpeeling, like peeling the layers, right? Like an artichoke or an onion, as you kind of unpack it and make sense of it for yourself. Maybe helpful to continue this reflection as we go. We're going to go into a break now. We're going to give you some time to have a break, and when we come back, we'll start to move into the next stage of our dialogue, which is about some of the tools and frameworks that might support you with bringing this together and thinking about, okay, these important conversations that you want to have. How do we do that? Some of the skill and tools that can support this.
Welcome back, everyone. If you're in the room and you're ready to start, you can either indicate in the chat or maybe turn your cameras on, just so we know that you're here. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Hey, Thompson, how are you? Just saw that you're here.
I've been here, I just came in a little late.
All righty. So we want to move into talking about how do we strategically have these conversations. And it's important that we understand that in order to have a high-stake conversation in a way that is really effective, it doesn't happen by accident. So they take intention at each stage. They also take planning. And in particularly when we're working to manage our own triggers or threat responses and those of other people around us as well. And what we've found is that in our work with leaders, we notice that sometimes most leaders will focus on their message and on the specific moment of sharing it. And in fact, other moments in the conversation are more important than just delivering the message. So when someone is highly skilled at a high-stake conversation, there are certain things that they'll do at different stages of the conversation just to ensure that the conversation is effective. So they tend to focus on the outcome that they want, right? So it's really important that you determine and decide, what is the outcome I'm reaching for? Why am I having this conversation? Then you attune to the other person as well. You want to make sure it's a conversation, that it's a dialogue, right? You want to self-manage, and that's in those moments when you want to jump in or emotions may get high, even though you've planned. You want to become so aware that you're able to manage those things so that you get the best results from your conversation. And so in order to do this well, there are 5 intentions that we need, or 5 elements of each conversations. And the very first one is to plan. And in the planning stage, what we're actually doing is we're creating clarity, right? And clarity could look like, what do I really want from this conversation, right? So when I walk away, when the conversation has ended, what is my desired outcome for myself, for the individual as well? And then we move into the opening. And what happens in the opening? We're creating the container. I want to call it almost like setting the stage, right? To have that conversation. We want to make sure that it's safe. We want to make sure that there's a shared purpose so they understand why we're having the conversation. And then we move into dialogue. So that's actually having the conversation. And that's really ensuring that you have created a shared understanding. And then we want to close the conversation. And but before we do that, we want to engage in that conversation. When we're holding the conversation, we want to ensure that we're curious, right? So we're really demonstrating curious inquiry and courageous advocacy. That's really important when you're actually holding that conversation. And then we want to talk about creating momentum, and that is keeping it actionable, communicate commitments and next steps. So what will happen? When will it happen? Who will do what? And maybe how do we check in? Right? And then sustaining that, which is creating accountability, and that is reflecting and monitoring the results. So let's talk a little bit about each stage in detail. So in the planning stage, what we offer is that you really pause and set your intention for the conversation. Your aim in this moment is really to create clarity for yourself before you begin to engage that person. And so you may ask yourself questions like, what do I want for this conversation? What do I want for the other person to understand? What do I want them to do as a result of the conversation? And how do I want them to feel during the conversation? And the SCARF model that we shared is really helpful here to help you anticipate the potential for a threat response. So what are you curious about learning from them? That's in the planning stage. You may also want to consider, what do you know about this person? Right? So you want to think about your relationship, consider your history. Are there any power dynamics in this relationship? You also want to take social identity into consideration as well. What identities do you share? You also want to take time to think about their motivations. So what do they hope for? What are the expectations? What are the needs? What do they value? What's important to them? And appreciation comes next. What do you appreciate about them? Right? So if you notice, when we're thinking about what do we know about this person, we're really balancing that conversation. We also want to think about potential obstacles. So what could get in the way of getting your message across? And last but not least, how do they prefer to be communicated to? So what is their preferred communication style? In the planning stage, you might want to ask yourself, am I ready to have this conversation? So are you feeling creative? Are you feeling open to learning? Or are you feeling triggered? So you want to make sure that you're checking in with yourself to see what's happening. Are you aware of your own biases in relation to the other person? Maybe ask yourself, do I care about this person personally? And what is important in the planning stage, if you've gone through really some self-reflection and asking yourself the outcome, what do you know about this person and are you ready? If you're not feeling ready, if you're not feeling safe, I'd like to offer that you not force the conversation because there's always choice. And if you feel you're ready, then the next step would be to engage the person. And in engaging, there are actually 3 distinct moments that happen. The very first moment is opening the conversation. And in doing that, your aim in this moment is really to create a container for the conversation, one that creates right condition for focus and safety for the other person as well as for yourself. So we think about things like privacy, right? Is there an audience? Can I move to somewhere that is private so the person can feel safe when we're having this conversation? You also want to think about time. Do I have enough time to engage? Is this conversation going to be rushed? Or have I allotted time for a conversation, a dialogue? We want to offer that you not jump into the conversation. One of the practices that we have at Strategy Sense, before every conversation, we center ourselves. So it's important as well that you center yourself, maybe do a check-in, right? Make sure that you're centered and ready. And in doing that, there should be a mutual understanding in terms of permission and consent, right? So you have permission from the other person that this is a good time for them, because it may be a great time for you, but just not a good time for them to engage in that conversation. You also want to ensure that there's a mutual understanding of the purpose and the intention of the conversation, because your first word in the conversation will set the tone. I often say that the first minute matters the most. So before jumping right into sharing what you intended to say, take some time to create the container for the conversation just by sharing your intentions. So communicate your intentions in a way that really connects to a shared purpose, such as it could be organizational, it could be strategic, it could be relational opportunities, and also include the invitation for dialogue. So it could sound like, I have something I'd like to discuss with you that I think would help how we work together more effectively. Or I'd like to talk about X with you, but first I'd like to get your point of view. So you really want to state what it is you want up front, right? Because usually in high-stake conversations, sometimes we don't want the person making an assumption, because then that impacts how they respond, right? So we want to be as clear as possible as to what our intentions are. The second moment is the dialogue. So deliver your message in dialogue. It's a conversation. It goes two ways. So you're aiming in this moment to create mutual understanding through a positive two-way conversation. You want to balance advocacy with inquiry. So when we talk about courageous advocacy, it means sharing your perspectives, even if it's difficult, in service of your shared purpose. And often this requires work in advance to be clear and concise. And so in doing that, you explain your assumptions and the underlying supporting data. I always like to talk that you balance feelings with facts, right? You want to make sure that you have some supporting data. You want to make sure that your reasoning is clear. Test your thinking in a way that is open and transparent. You want to give some examples of probably the experience, focusing on just the facts. It's also important that when you're having this dialogue, that you try to picture the other person's perspective, right? So we don't want to enter into that space in a way that is defensive. So what is that person saying? Are you able to shift your perspective just to be curious enough to maybe get a picture of what the other person is saying? And then there's curious inquiry, and that looks like asking questions and listening attentively. And when we do this, it enables us really to understand their perspective and to expand your current understanding. And active listening looks like there's eye contact, you're paying attention to what's not being said by the other person. So you're really looking at body language, you want to avoid interrupting, you want to reflect back what was being said. And what you're doing in that moment, you're checking for your own understanding. And that could sound like, I hear you saying that. It sounds as if X is important to you. And then going deeper in the inquiry, you might want to ask some really powerful questions. And these questions are usually open-ended questions just to clarify their perspective so that there's not any assumptions, so that what you've heard and understood is what they've said. And that could sound like you probably say, what is important to you about X is, right? What outcomes are you hoping for? What would you say we agree on? And when you think about inquiry, it's a very valuable strategy to handle resistance. So when you encounter resistance, stay in the space of inquiry. What I find sometimes is that we tend to gloss over because it's not a comfortable space, but it's in that moment that you'll be able to learn, to resolve, and to understand. Listen genuinely to whatever concerns they have and keep the discussion open. We want to document and also address any concerns. And I think that's where the magic happens. When we're creating that mutual understanding, when we're curious, and when we are courageous in advocating.
This is a place as well, just to blend in here, where, you know, models like the SCARF model that we talked about earlier,
right.
When we're in that space of really curious inquiry, we can start to reveal what may be there for people around status, around certainty, you know, around autonomy, around relatedness, around fairness, to help inform the points that you make, the questions that you might continue to ask, or even the strategies that you might recommend around, if it's a problem-solving conversation, or even trying to look at alignment, finding alignment, maybe getting clearer, helping to provide clarity that supports people to minimize a threat response, right? Or maybe there's more work to be done beyond the conversation. Staying in that space of curiosity can support you with that.
Right, and I'm seeing some comments in the chat as well. So Ben is saying he really appreciates the reminder to be curious. And Jan, just to add to what you're saying, when we talk about staying in that moment, what you may realize is that you probably have to go back to the opening, right? Because you may realize that, maybe what I am hoping for, or maybe the way I've explained my intention, or let me dig a little bit deeper just to clarify. Is the space still feeling like a safe space? Is it still feeling like we have that shared purpose? Right? So it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, but you may move between just to ensure that you're getting the desired outcome that you want.
And Ben has reminded us to the potential for over-identifying with your ideas or your issue that you're bringing forward in the conversation. Right? Don't let your ideas become your identity. Quite profound, Ben, as a reminder, because that can get in the way of what we're trying to create, what you're trying to co-create with others.
Yeah. And he's also saying that if you define yourself by your opinions, questioning them is a threat to your identity.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Ben. And so when you're comfortable enough in that conversation, when you think about your purpose, when you're able to look at it from different perspectives, when there's dialogue and the individual feels safe enough to start maybe disclosing their thoughts, their opinions, their feelings, what they want going forward, and you're able to do the same thing, it is probably time to bring the conversation to a close. And you want to close the conversation in a way that really drives and creates momentum. So, and that looks like really holding space for each other to state their commitments, right? So what are you willing to do? What are they willing to do, right? Who will do what? By when will they get it done? And when will you follow up? And I find sometimes that we may close the conversation without these things, right? And so the conversation is not the resolution, it's the beginning, right? It's the beginning of what is happening. You've just shared your views, your opinions, your desires, your perspective. And so you're giving that person something to sit with and vice versa. So it's important that you maybe schedule some time to follow up, right? Based on what we agreed on, based on what we said, based on what we discussed, and decide who will do it, by when will they do it, and what does that look like in terms of following up. And then we want to sustain that. And what we're sustaining is the way that we've built the relationship, right? And in doing that, we're creating accountability for yourself and the other person. So really take some time, just as you took the time to plan, it's important that you reflect on, how did I do in that conversation? What impact did I have in that conversation in contrast with your intentions? So bottom line is you're asking yourself, did I meet my intentions? Is this the desired outcome that I had set out to do? Sometimes it's important that you reach out and you ask for feedback. You want to track and monitor the commitments that you made with each other. Did you follow through? Did you do what you said you would have done? Right? And you want to take action without delay on your own commitments. So what can you do in the next 24 hours that will really help you to get things going? And it doesn't have to be anything big. It could be, okay, you're going to maybe reflect and think about what went well. It could also be maybe you create a plan, right? So sometimes when we talk about taking action, we find that individuals may say, oh, I'm not ready. But what can you do that will drive that process? And I usually like to say, what can you do in the next 24 hours that will help you to sustain and that will help you to remain accountable to what you said you would do? We encourage that you stay in contact. So maybe schedule a second conversation, right? And what you're doing in that moment is just determining and deciding based on what we agreed to, where are we now? Really important. And so I'm going to pause here for a minute. And I'd like to ask, based on all the steps that we've just shared with you, is there any particular step that is resonating with you? So when you take a look at the planning stage, when you take a look at the engaging stage, or even sustaining, which of these steps has the most impact on a conversation success, in your opinion? And most importantly, what gets in the way of having conversations with this level of intention? So if go ahead, you can unmute. What's resonating? What's here now for you?
For me, this is Sukriti. For me, I think the two things that resonate the most are kind of stating an intention when you begin the conversation before you actually go into anything. And also asking for intention. I think that it's really helpful to align on intention. And also the inquiry piece, I think, is huge.
Yeah.
I think that oftentimes getting into a high stakes conversation, it's easy to get lost in your own narrative. But remembering that it's a conversation between not just you and your mind, but also between you and somebody else. That comes from the place of inquiry, and it actually livens up the conversation a lot more.
Right. Thank you. And that's where the dialogue comes in, right? It's like ping pong, it's back and forth. You've spoken, you've listened, you're giving the person another opportunity. It's almost like a dance with that person. Thank you for sharing. Go ahead, Kyle.
Thank you. The part that resonated most with me is the planning. I think it reminds me of a couple of things. The first is there's the Lincoln quote, you know, if I had an hour to chop down a tree, I'd spend the first 45 sharpening the axe. So it's really about planning what you want out of it. And I think in our day-to-day lives, it's so busy that we can plan our own perspective, but sometimes we forget you need to sort of think about what the other party to the conversation may be bringing and what their intentions are as well.
Yeah.
And so that the first bullet under, I think there was a slide showed previously, was understand. And so I'm reminded of a Stephen Covey quote that is like, seek first to understand and then to be understood. So it really, the planning part really resonated.
Right. Thank you for sharing. And that's so true, because sometimes we jump into these conversations without planning, right? We don't think about the outcome. We don't think about what do you know about the person? And that's really important for you to take into consideration as well. And are you ready to have the conversation, right? And are you going in with an open mind to understand their perspective, even though there may be a difference in opinion? And that's why you're probably having the conversation in the first place, right? So thank you so much for sharing that, Kyle. Anyone else wants to share any resonance?
I'll add in, as we're thinking about sharing, that this space of planning, not to certainly all these spaces of conversations are really helpful, but this place of planning, this space here, and if I can get the slide to advance, the outcome, understanding of what we know about the other person, and are you ready, can sometimes be a point where, for myself and for the clients that I work with, we use this tool, sometimes realize that actually conversation, they may not be ready. It may need to involve other parties. It may not be the right person for this conversation. They may need to bring in other allies or colleagues in priming and prepping for this conversation, right? There's a lot of other aspects of what goes into a conversation that can really get articulated and figured out here, right? As some of you said in the chat earlier on, you know, determining the modality, is it text, is it in person, is it by phone, like that, it can also be figured out here as well, in terms of really understanding the what you're trying to get out of the conversation and where is the other person at right now, and what are some of the obstacles that might get in the way.
Yeah.
Kyle, go ahead.
Yeah, Jan, something you just said reminded me of a high stakes conversation that went unexpectedly well. And it was because I had engaged influencers, sounds like a bad word in our Instagram world, but those that would influence this individual, I had engaged them prior to and sort of not necessarily got them on board when informed. And it made the initial conversation, the subsequent conversation so much better. And it
Yes.
was unplanned. That wasn't my intent, but that was my lesson learned out of it was if you can influence the right individuals, maybe before you have that high stakes conversation, it can actually make it the stakes kind of bend in your favor.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh.
If any of you've heard of the term, the meeting before the meeting, right? So often it can go to conversations before the conversation or meetings before meetings to also help by, as you talk about influencing is two-way. I wonder if Colette, you also gained insight that supported you. Yeah, in that conversation, that's often what some of the discoveries that we experience in these conversations that people have around the learnings here as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you a moment now to just reflect, because it can be challenging sometimes to really slow down enough to plan a high stake conversation, as Jan just said. So I'd like you to think of a high stake conversation that you need to have. And perhaps it's related to an example that you've been workshopping here today, or perhaps it's a different situation. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to really prepare for that conversation. And there's a worksheet on page 13 in your action planner. And think about the different stages, the different moments. Maybe just get your thoughts together. Here's your opportunity to really slow down and to create a plan for that conversation.
So take 5 minutes to plan out your conversation. We'll be moving you into breakout rooms for some dialogue after those 5 minutes. So it's now 8:05. I'll give you till 8:10 and I'll be putting you in breakout rooms. I'll explain the exercise before we put you in the breakout rooms.
So just another minute to wrap up your final thoughts. Alrighty, so in a moment, we'll be moving you into breakout rooms. And when you get there, I'd like to offer that you share a bit about the conversation that you are preparing to have and about the person in question. And that's whatever you feel comfortable sharing. And there's no reason or no need to share every single detail that you have in your worksheet. What I'd love for you to focus on is what will be important to keep in mind as you have this conversation. And as you listen to your partner, I want you to think about what we spoke about initially. How do you get ready for the conversation, right? Is attuning to the other person, is really focusing on the outcome that you need and develop increased self-awareness, right? And maybe a little bit of peer coaching, right? So if you're the listener, get curious to see what's here, right? What is there anything that's missing? And then when you get back, we'll be asking for some insights or some takeaways from your conversation. You'll be in pairs this time. We want to give you 20 minutes to have this conversation. So really slow down, take the time, ask for feedback, share your context, share how you're feeling about the conversation, what makes this conversation high-stake conversation. Welcome back, everyone. So I want us to take a moment now just to share what you're taking away from that conversation that you just had, where you had the opportunity to talk a little bit about your conversation, the planning stage. So what are you taking away? And as you were listening, what were some of the things that really supported you attuning to the other person, focusing on the outcome and self-managing? You can unmute or you can share in the chat just about your experience, insights, takeaways. What was it like having that conversation or sharing your plan with the other person?
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
It's not so much about, well, what I find myself wondering about is how much do these same strategies apply in maybe like conversations not just between two people, but like say a group conversation, or if you are looking to facilitate a conversation, which I'm looking forward to facilitating a sort of a strategic conversation at the end of the month. And I do feel like a lot of these prompts are really helpful, right? Like, how do you want them to, what do you want the group to understand? What do you want the outcomes of that conversation to be?
Right.
Understanding what people need from it. But I guess what comes to my mind is like, how does the process change when you're dealing with a group versus, you know, like just one-on-one? Like, does it make it harder? Does it make it easier? And in what ways? So I guess I'm trying to translate this process in a way to thinking beyond just a one-on-one conversation, but maybe a bigger group conversation as well.
So what I'm hearing is you're facilitating that group conversation, correct?
Yeah.
Right. So you would still go through the phases. You would still plan the conversation. So the planning remains the same. And maybe what you would like to consider is, what do you know about the individuals in the group, right? So it may take a little bit of deepening. What do you know about the group collectively, right? Has this group worked together before? What is the value of this group, right? And then facilitating that conversation, maybe determining the way you'd like the conversation to go, right? And just be open to that dialogue. So I think the process remains the same. I think it's how you go about it. And this will be a little bit more inclusive because you're talking about a group, but things to consider. What do you know about members of the group? What do you know about the group itself? So individually and collectively as well.
What have others found in the room here who may have thought, either experienced this using similar tools or frameworks in a group conversation, or you yourself were thinking about the translation of this to a group setting? What do others think about how this might be different? What might you keep in mind? Anyone else in the room who might have an insight to share with Jamila or others? Still thinking about it, maybe. Go ahead, Alicia.
I have a question for Jamil. Like, how big is the group? Is it like 10 people? Is it 50 people?
It's probably about 25 to 30 people. Yeah.
The reason I ask is like this, like I had never seen this outside of like client perspective, but like we do this think, feel, do exercise with a lot of our clients. I work in PR, and like I have found, one, I've never thought about applying it to like internal conversations. So this was like a breakthrough moment for me mentally. But two is like those I have found from a client perspective, like it's really hard to do those with like a group of 25 people. So if there is a world in which you can break it down into smaller groups, I don't logistically, based on what you're going through, I don't know if that's even possible, but it's just this idea of like, even like in this session, right? Like we've been quiet today, right? And like, I think some of the conversations have actually been happening in the smaller breakout rooms, not in this larger session, because this is a challenging topic to discuss. So I don't know if there's like a motive or a reason you can make to do a smaller group, but that I think could help.
That's helpful insight. Thank you, Alicia.
Thanks so much, Alicia.
What do you take away from that, Jamila?
It's really helpful. I think I've noticed that in my own work. You know, the breakout groups are extremely helpful. They make people feel more comfortable. I think for me, it'll be about making sure we all get back to the same place. That's all at the end of it, you know? Like, I think breakout groups are wonderful if you talk about different cases or like you kind of break it up a little. And it's the skill that comes afterwards where you have to create alignment of all those conversations, if you know, to hopefully get to this like understanding you're trying to achieve, right? So it is really helpful.
I'm going back to the wise words from Ben and others that have shared in the chat and in the room up until now, with some suggestions around thinking about curiosity in this instance, right? So how can you lean in with extreme curiosity, of course, framing your conversation, but lean in with extreme curiosity and be mindful of the identity that you place with yourself and the topic, and see what emerges in the large group that you're trying to kind of support to kind of evolve or work through this conversation, right? Look at the curious lens and what questions might you need to put in the space to help reveal what's there, what needs to happen in the conversation. Any others who want to share? What are you taking away, or what questions perhaps emerged for you that you're still pondering?
And so I see in the chat, Anna is sharing that it was really therapeutic. So maybe just having that space to unpack and to share or to say it out loud sometimes. Thank you for sharing, Anna. Anna Kay. And so you may be wondering, you know, after you do all this planning and you're entering the conversation, what happens if the conversation still goes off the rail? What are your thoughts around that? What are some strategies you think you could implement if you've done all this and you're finding that the conversation goes off the rail?
What do you do?
Mm-hmm.
Or what have you done?
Yeah.
Maybe share in the chat.
This is Kasha. I think in that situation, sometimes it's helpful to just like reset the intention. So to say, like, it wasn't my, oh, like I see that like I've really like struck a nerve or something like that, and just to say it wasn't at all my intention to like have us argue. So like we can either like not like, you know, drop this and come back to it later, or like, is there a better way to talk about this?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Great. That's like taking us back to the planning stage, right? Restating the intention. Is this the right time? Do we need to take a break or pause?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What else have others done or tried or seen or observed other people do well?
Hi. Yeah. So completely agreed with resetting and coming back to intention and checking in with yourself and the other people about where we're at and if it makes sense to continue right now. And then the second piece that comes to my mind is expressing vulnerability in that moment can often be a doorway to open, often open the doorway for others to do the same.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're feeling overwhelmed or triggered or something, it really, really helps to acknowledge that. Yeah, that was, yeah. I lost train of some of my thought, but that was kind of what I was thinking.
Oh, so just being in the moment and revealing what you're experiencing.
Yeah.
That can be a great space to learn that you're not alone, that your colleague or colleagues maybe also having a similar experience. Yeah. That can open the door. Go ahead, Nicole. Sorry.
Yeah, and Claire mentioned something in the chat that you try to hone in on the trigger, right? That seemed to have caused the conversation to go off the rail and maybe understand the other person's point of view. Yeah.
It's another great opportunity for curiosity.
Yeah.
Right, to help understand. Sometimes that scarf model we talked about, there may be something there at play for yourself or for the other person around status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And I can't repeat that model enough because there's quite a lot that can fall into those buckets particularly when conversations go off the rails.
Yeah. And in thinking about that, Jan, as you're mentioning, sometimes there is resistance, right? So sometimes you've done all the planning and the prep and you enter into that conversation and oops, there's resistance. It's not going as you thought it would have gone. They're not receiving it as you thought they would have received it. And so how do you handle resistance? And so the next slide will share some tips, make some offers as to if you find that this is happening, just some things that you can do. This is definitely not the end all and the be all in terms of suggestions, but just some tips for you. Stay curious, right? Take a break. You may need to time out there, walk away sometimes if some emotions are getting too high. Call on your allies, right? Maybe escalate. So maybe you need a mediator. Maybe you need to take it higher. maybe moderate your approach. So maybe just reflect, was that the right approach? Could I have taken another approach? And explore perspectives and learning. So what did you learn in that moment? What might have caused the resistance? How would you approach this or a similar conversation differently? It's just some tips for you there to consider. And so as we move into wrapping up our session, I'd like to pause here and just offer that you take a moment in your action planner to take note of 1 or 2 actions that you will take after the workshop, keeping in mind that particular conversation that you are desiring to have, that high-stake conversation. What will you implement going in, or what actions will you take?
If you could narrow down to one thing, what's one action that, as a result of perhaps the learnings that you had today, either in this larger room or in your small breakout rooms, what's one action that you will take after today's session to get you further along in this conversation that you need to have or want to have or will have or are having? For those conversations that are multi-stage, multi-phased.
Hi, it's Grant here. I think for me, to actually plan, strategize, and put it on paper, I often jump into very difficult conversations with kind of the goal in our heads and in our minds, and without having actually, thought about the possibilities of what happens if it goes off the rails, what happened, what is the dynamic between my side and the other side, and even though, and challenging our assumptions, or even us making assumptions of the other side. I think the tool in helping design these conversations is kind of that basic first step that I certainly have not implemented in my work in having a lot of these difficult discussions in things like my board work, for example. And there are a lot of difficult conversations at the board I'm at.
Yeah, well, that's excellent. So imagine you've had so many where you can go from here with just the added tweak to your process of adding in some planning. I'll offer, it might feel like a lot of steps. There's a lot of material that we've given you this evening. It may or may not. Certainly for some of you, it may, for some of you, it may not feel like a lot. And with practice, you can move through these worksheets, or even just mentally prepare using the frameworks with greater ease, and perhaps less paperwork if required in going into these conversations. The important opportunity is to start the practice of sort of adding in some of these elements to round out your preparation. If you haven't been doing them up until now.
Yeah. And Jen, I often find that accountability helps sometimes, right? So if you have an accountability partner, you probably shared your intentions with them, what you're hoping to do. Maybe that's something that you can implement as well. And so what I want to offer is the individual that you were having the conversation with, maybe just check in with them in a week or so to see, what have you done? How are you doing on your commitment to get ready for that conversation?
Great. A few others. See, Jamila, you mentioned in the chat another important takeaway or action for yourself. That SCARF model. Important takeaway. What other important takeaways or actions do others have? One thing either you're going to act on, or something that really resonated for you in this workshop, or perhaps in a breakout room. You may not want to share publicly. You can certainly capture this in your workbook. This is an important action for yourself. Nona, please go ahead.
Thanks so much. We didn't really talk about this, but Kasia and I talked about it in our breakout room, and it resonated with me the most. And it's actually to lower the stakes for myself, frankly, in the conversation, not put so much pressure on me to maybe even have it or have the conversation the way I think it should go, or maybe there's a pre-conversation to just gauge if there's trust there in order to have the conversation to begin with. And so taking it even, back a step and lowering those expectations a bit.
Mhm.
Thank you, Nona. That lowering the stakes in a high stakes conversation, right? Just really managing the expectations. Such a really helpful insight, similar to the identity that Ben was talking about, the identifying with the topic, really trying to stay calm and non-anxious and less attached to the outcome, but committed to the outcome, right?
Mhm.
There's a difference. So
Yeah.
thinking about that and distinguishing that for yourself. I hear that insight for you, Nona. Thank you. Any others? Okay.
And so as we wrap up our session this evening, if you care to share maybe the word or two based on your takeaway. So you're not making a whole sentence or a commitment, just what are you taking away from the entire session today?
You're asking in the chat? You want
In the
that?
chat,
to be
yeah.
shared in the
You can
chat?
just share in the chat. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Just a word or two of what you're taking away, or a word of how you're feeling.
Mhm.
Where are you? Thank you, Claire. Strategies.
Right. Uh-huh. Planning. Uh-huh. Confidence. Uh-huh.
Think about your intention for today, for those of you who are looking. What
Mhm.
your intention was for this workshop. What are you taking away in relation to that intention? Thank you, Kasha. Thank you, Sukriti. Okay. Some are still reflecting. That's a meaty topic. We know that.
Mhm. The meeting before the meeting.
The meeting before the meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alicia. Okay. So we've really valued our time with you all today. And before we wrap up, we'd love to get your feedback and ask that you complete. You can just take a moment to click on the link in the chat and provide your feedback in our feedback survey. The feedback you provide helps to both inform our content as we continue to refine and strengthen the work that we do at Strategy Sense and the work that we do with the Civic Action. We have another workshop with all of you in August. So any insight or feedback that you may have that can help inform and support our continued work with you would be very helpful. And we share anonymized feedback back with Civic Action as well in support of their work. And thank you, Eli. Trust in yourself as an additional takeaway. Thank you for that. Back to you, Nicole.
Well, thank you, everyone. And there's an additional resource that Jan is going to be dropping in the chat that speaks to nonviolent communication, a language of life. So if you're looking to further your reading, deepen your understanding, get some more information, that's a resource that we want to share with you. So thank you all so much. I know it's not easy to have a full day and then show up for a session. So you showed up. So I want to just say thank you for showing up. For those of you who shared, whether in this room or in the breakouts, I know the breakouts were really going, and that's usually where the magic happens. So thank you so much for sharing. Have a great rest of your day and a great rest of the week. And if you have any questions, Jen and I will be staying on for just a few minutes to answer those questions. If not, have yourself a great evening, and we'll see you in August.